Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our John Whitney Hall lecture for 2026. My name is Fabian Drixler. I'm the current chair of the Council on East Asian Studies. I would be very tempted to introduce this evening's distinguished speaker, John Treat. He's a man who's left a great legacy here at Yale, although he's not perfect. He served on my search committee, and I didn't. Yeah. So at least one mistake that he made in his time here. But it felt Mimi Yang Pruksawan will give that introduction, and my role is to say a few words about our lecture series. The lecture series was established through a gift of Robin Hall in memory of her late husband. John Whitney Hall was a defining figure in the generation that established the study of Japanese history as a vibrant field in this country. He was born, as quite a few people in that generation were, to missionary parents in Japan, growing up in Tokyo, Maebashi, and Kyoto. He then did his undergraduate degree at Amherst, returned to Japan to teach at Doshisha, strikingly all the way to 1941. So I think he would have had some interesting reflections to share with us on the topic of today's talk. Then during the Pacific War, served in naval intelligence for the United States, went to Harvard to do a PhD in East Asian languages and literatures, then taught at the University of Michigan, and in 1961 was recruited to come and teach at Yale. I want to be brief here, so I will not go into detail about the many, many intellectual contributions he made. But I would just like to say that he left a legacy as a great thinker, a great historian, an important mentor to rising graduate students, but also as an academic leader, as an administrator, somebody who created spaces where the work of other people could thrive. And when we decide whom to invite for the John Whitney Hall lecture, it is these qualities that we want to see reflected in the distinguished scholars we bring here. And with that in mind, it's a great joy to me that John Treat's name has been added to the distinguished list of people whom you see on the handouts if you received one filing in. And with that, I'd like to hand things over to Mimi Yang Pruksawan.
Thank you. Mic working? Thank you. I'm honored. I think I may not be the right person to do this. In fact, I'm at a loss for words. How do I introduce John Whittier Treat? Yale Emeritus, a daring scholar and thinker and writer, who is also a public intellectual, who is also a good friend over nearly 3 decades. I'm going to give it a try. Please bear with me. I've prepared comments, remarks, so I stick to the narrative. To be honest, I would much rather be sitting in a comfortable bar somewhere with John and Douglas Lind, as a mathematician, husband, seated right there. I'd rather be sitting there and talking about what the future may hold. Right now, as we find ourselves yet again, at least in my lifetime, hearing the clarion call of war and its propagandists, which is where John's lecture may take us today, but I'll get to that in just a moment. John attended Amherst College, followed by Yale for his MA and PhD, degrees in East Asian languages and literatures. This was followed by an MFA in creative writing from Antioch University in Los Angeles. He taught at Yale from 1999 through 2014, served twice as chair of the Department of East Asian Languages and Literatures. After Yale, John held visiting professorships at the University of Oslo, Ewa University, Seoul National University, and the University of New South Wales. John has published 5 scholarly books. Writing Ground Zero, Japanese Literature and the Atomic Bomb, published in 1995, received the Association of American University Press's Hitomi Arisawa Award in 1996 and the John Whitney Hall Prize in 1997. And it was published in Japanese translation in 2010. His other books include Contemporary Japan and Popular Culture, 1996, Great Mirror Shattered, Homosexuality, Orientalism in Japan, 1999, and The Rise and Fall of Modern Japanese Literature, 2018. He's currently writing Too Close to the Sun, Korea, Collaboration, and the World. John is also a poet and a fiction writer. His first novel, The Rise and Fall of the Yellow House, 2015, on the AIDS pandemic in the Northwest, was a finalist for the Lambda Literary Prize. First Consonants, about a family of stutterers living in the Alaskan outback, was published in 2022. He has a number of short stories and another book on the way. I could go on listing John's many accomplishments as an academic and writer, awards, honors, book prizes, but I think I've made my point. So let me turn to what he plans to share with us today, which I see as an exemplification of what has made John much more than an accomplished academic with lots of feathers in his cap. What I mean to say that in the public forum of ideas and critique, his is a voice that rings true through all the noise. It has been said by some that in the age of reason and machine intelligence, we have lost our rootedness in the past, in memory, and the lessons that we learn from that. In today's lecture, Collaboration in the Japanese Empire, the Stakes of Moral Judgment, John offers a rumination on morality, on collaboration, on occupation and war, in which he asks us to face such lessons from history and their realities, and what they mean for us today. He asks us not to look away in all of his work. A few minutes ago, I looked at the news. I cannot think of a more relevant contribution to our public discourse today than what John will offer us in the coming lecture. Thank you, and please join me in welcoming John Whittier Treat.
Thank you, Mimi. This is a great honor, not simply because it's the John Whitney Hall Lecture, but because it's at Yale, where I left so many dear colleagues behind 11 years ago, because New Haven is my hometown, and I have not been here in a long time. My sister is here. My brother-in-law is here. I'm expecting in a wheelchair one of my high school teachers. You know, I was looking back over the previous 25 Hall lecturers, and with one exception, I know them all personally. And I'm just wondering how many future Hall lecturers you have that will be able to say that. This honor is coming at the end of my career, and I look forward to what new people will have to add. John Hall was still teaching at Yale when I was a graduate student here. I never took a class from him. I wish I had. But I did inadvertently slam the door to Maury's in his face once. I have a special regard for Hall. He did not hesitate to take on big issues in Japanese history, which is to say big issues in history. I hope to do the same today. So let me begin. Having lived through the 20th century's 2 world wars, John Dewey, arguably the century's most important philosopher, wrote, "The distinctive office, problems, and subject matter of philosophy grow out of stresses and strains in the community life in which a given form of philosophy arises, and that, accordingly, its specific problems vary with the changes in human life that are always going on and at times constitute a crisis and a turning point in human history." Dewey was right to point out that due to improvements in the modern world, philosophy entered the 20th century with optimism, yet less than halfway through was bereft of it. What is scarce in Dewey, as in much moral philosophy, is reference to the profound historical fissures of the past century of which he and others were aware and which, by rights, should have made them moral skeptics. Instead, as Lukács indicted Adorno for, philosophy, quote, gazed upon the agony of man as if it were an alpine vista. The best we can do, no longer certain of teleological moral progress, is to substitute a hope that alongside history, might explain why we can't. Ethics as a field was generally out of favor after 1945, writes one Don at Oxford, where ethical discourse was considered meaningless, notwithstanding how many ethical questions the war had raised. Some insisted moral philosophy was not philosophy. This is no lapse limited to modern times, but perhaps no century found ethical problems more unsolvable than the 20th. And still, philosophers concoct abstract puzzles rather than cite those problems. The problem is that when we posit a hypothetical scenario, we posit a hypothetical world. We have to be wary of the unusual cases philosophers with axes to grind can dream up. None of us lives in Kant's kingdom of ends, where rational beings always do the right thing and do it in the same way. Philosophers, it has been charged, often spin their tales devoid of human experience. But it's also true that philosophy flourishes after wars. Surely a human experience, especially if you are on the losing side. Socrates fought for Athens against the Peloponnesians. Hobbes did his best work in exile after the English Civil War. Wittgenstein began Tractatus while at the front in World War I. And Jean-Paul Sartre was the Reich's prisoner of war. But World War II failed to inspire much philosophical innovation. There are a few philosophers like the Yale-trained John K. Roth, writing on ethics after the Holocaust, who say they were tripped up by history. Even in Roth's case, his phrasing suggests philosophy might be smooth sailing were it not for what thinkers encounter in the world of action, and that places philosophy somewhere apart. The notion that moral philosophers can study the concepts of morality merely by reflecting, Oxford armchair style, on what those around him or her say and do is barren. In 1938, R.G. Collingwood opined that the chief business of 20th century philosophy is to reckon with 20th century history. But by and large, his contemporaries did not take his advice. But since the collapse of moral ideals amid the carnage of wars, Auschwitz and Hiroshima, Nanjing, and Dresden, we cannot read Aristotle, Kant, or Heidegger without conceding that philosophy's metaphysics has, in the end, if not the beginning, relevance for attempts at moral resuscitation. The disrepute in which universalism found itself after the failure of the Enlightenment's emancipatory project to forestall 20th century barbarism led to the consensus that universalism is always someone's universalism and not shared by all. As Zygmunt Bauman put it, universalism comes with an address. Everyone is seldom everyone, as we can see in the moral relativism at work in traffic courts, as well as in international prosecutions of war criminals. The opposite is also true. Aristotle, Kant, and Heidegger are reread from the perspective of a world altered by conflicts, making no distinction between combatant and civilian, by global epidemics that exacerbate class distinctions, by economic depressions that refute faith in progress, by genocide, a practice we once thought we were done with, by environmental collapse and unstoppable terrorism. Recalling recent catastrophes, we need not be hypothetical. It is one thing to say, no ethical principles have been proved, another to deny that nations have been founded, battles fought, and revolutions authorized in their name. For those of us who approach philosophy historically as well as analytically, we have a catastrophe in and of itself. Quote, "It is evident we are at a primitive stage of moral development," writes Thomas Nagel, a philosopher with the Vietnam War in mind. The idea that the basic principles of morality are known and that the problems all come in their interpretation and application is one of the most fantastic conceits to which our conceited species has been drawn. The 20th century illustrates this. It was 100 years of good intentions and disastrous results, which is reason enough to critique intentionality in moral evaluation. If intentions are irrelevant and consequences unknowable, what does the individual seeking ethical instruction do? The dilemma is not abstract, and historical figures were caught in this bind. Some names are familiar, others are not, which suggests that any of us can be trapped in ethical incommensurabilities. I have been called anachronistic for looking back on Japan's colony in Korea from the standpoint of moral philosophy today. My retort is that even while moral inquiry may be too important to be left to philosophers alone, it is the historians who need to be on guard against simplistic moral approbation or dismissal. Philosophers are trained to be wary of such judgments. Elizabeth Anscombe began her 1958 essay, Modern Moral Philosophy, with the admonition, "It is not profitable at present to do moral philosophy." She asked her colleagues to build a sound philosophy of psychology first. This was not done. Modern skepticism ruled the decades following her essay, and that was that. But sophism is receding, and in the half century since Anscombe's essay, moral philosophy has staged a return. A century that we now can survey in its entirety. The problem of ethics is once more the question of how the lives, interest, and welfare of others makes claims on us and how these claims in various guises are to be reconciled with living our lives. My research focuses on Koreans who collaborated with the Japanese Empire while the peninsula was part of it. As a protectorate in 1905, to formal annexation in 1910, and concluding with liberation in 1945. I provisionally adopt sociologist Jong-Chul Kim's definition of collaborators as those who work with or for external forces occupying the nation. And wartime Asia featured a large cast of such, from Manchuria's Henry Puyi to Indonesia's Sukarno. But I choose Korea. First, collaboration during occupation and war remains an active controversy in Korea, even against the backdrop of what historians call the lingering untouchability of the issue. On the eve of the present millennium, Andre Schmidt, a scholar of modern Korea, declared that no matter what problem arises in Korean society, it is never unrelated to the collaboration. But why, when this is not true, say, in France? Perhaps because Korea showcases the beneficial and baneful consequences of modernity, foreign invasion and colonization, national division and civil war, but also miraculous economic growth. Still, the past 100-year history of Korea-Japan relations has the legacy of pro-Koreans as, it's been said, quote, a small bone stuck in the throat. When Jong-Chul Kim notes that the term Chinulpa is almost synonymous with traitors, the almost is inserted there surely because the pro-Japanese faction's collaboration with Imperial Japan is a modern affair. Without the notion of the nation state and the presumption of fealty to it, we are back in a world of treasonous courtiers and generals, not writers and poets, who were folded into the nomenclature of the Chinulpa on the heels of Korean bureaucrats, police, landowners, and industrialists. Like Po-Shek Fu, who has written about writers in occupied China, I've been fascinated by moral choices under oppressive conditions. There are not many of us. Even fewer have not refrained from passing verdicts, though they tend to be more nuanced than post-war historiography has had it, where the principal tension of the colonial period was between self-serving collaboration and sacrificial nationalist resistance. In his book, Just and Unjust Wars, Michael Walzer says, quote, the study of judgments and justifications in the real world move us closer to questions of moral philosophy, but it does not require a direct engagement with those questions. I disagree. Philosophical arguments often move forward with the aid of paradigmatic case examples crafted rather than cited because it is easy. The real world does not find it easy. Warren Quinn, in contrasting objectivist and subjectivist approaches to moral questions, invents the example of a state that requires its citizens to keep their radios off at all times. We can do better than that. For years, we've read that North Korea orders citizens to keep their radios always on. I'm sure some disobey. My question is how one decides to or not. Historians are wont to distinguish between collaborators, those who were out for a share of the conqueror's spoils, and collaborationists who seek an alliance with their new rulers to spare their country's annihilation, or to make their native land a replica of the ruler's own. The distinction is muddy at best. Here, philosophy takes the lead. philosophy can more easily establish the possibility of moral dilemmas than their existence, because discussions of possibility need not rely on actual examples. But the reality of moral dilemmas has never been in doubt, while the plausibility of hypothetical ones is. Perhaps philosophy's attachment to rationality since Kant, despite Schopenhauer's efforts to replace it with compassion, made a mistake, sorry. Compassion, which Primo Levi, yes, we got it, says evades all logic, has stalled it. I am sympathetic to Schopenhauer. My view is that emotion, and appreciation of it, if not its indulgence, is indispensable because hardly any human experience is free of it, though study of it has moved from philosophy to psychology. Our Anglo-American philosophical traditions, observes Martha Nussbaum, have tended to assume that the ethical text should, in the process of inquiry, converse with the intellect alone. It should not make its appeal to the emotions. There are moral choices arising from the worst of 20th century history that I excuse, because sometimes the ethical dilemmas people faced were inhuman, however they resolved to act. I am not alone in wanting to remain compassionate. Korea historian Charter Eckert says, quote, "The morality of the historian is ultimately humanistic. When the historian renders judgment, let those judgments be made not merely with a vision of hindsight, but also from a scholarly, empathetic understanding of the full temporal and psychic content of the human lives and actions being studied." Still, philosophers are fond of schematics. One sums it up this way, quote, "Philosophy has generally been more concerned with what goes on in people's heads than what goes on in the world." This dismissal risks throwing the baby out with the bathwater, but is true enough. Hannah Arendt explored the territory between history and ethics in the time she lived through: fascism, Stalinism, war, exile, genocide, nuclear weapons, all of which broke the continuity of history. In 1954, she thought 2 world wars and totalitarianism had left philosophy much better prepared than ever before, and that philosophers would be more willing to concede the relevance of politics. From our perspective today, we cannot agree. It may be gratuitous to append an ethical test of the actors to a historical narrative, but sketching such a narrative is simply my means of reaching that test. Quote, "Historians must legitimately ask how the moral subject that collaboration presupposes was fashioned," writes Timothy Brooke of Wartime China. But Brooke is naive to insist we mustn't retrospectively judge that subject's acts. Brooke is in good company, since many of us have discarded the moral binary of collaboration versus resistance and replaced it with, in Primo Levi's phrase that has traveled far, the gray zone of lived circumstances we cannot inhabit and therefore must hesitate to judge. Moral judgment, Levy awarded, is a judgment that we would like to entrust only to those who have found themselves in similar circumstances and had the opportunity to test for themselves what it means to act under coercion. And as we know, thanks to psychologist Stanley Milgram, his experiments in the basement of Lindsay Chit with 40 fellow New Haveners proved that people who thought they would disobey immoral orders learned otherwise. I'll add this. no matter what you think your moral principles are, given the choice to save your spouse or two strangers after a plane crash, I know what you will do. The strength of any ethical system, including that with which we judge collaborators, may reside as much in its ability to accommodate the contingencies of the particular and unanticipated situation as in any bedrock non-negotiable values. It has been said that we know more of Vichy's accommodation with Germany than we do of the French people's legacy of resistance. I do not see that true of the Second World War writ large. Compared with the work on resistance to German occupation, little has been done on any theoretical definition of the phenomenon. Post-World War II historiography has focused on resistance to tyranny rather than collaboration with it, and within the historiography on collaboration, more on cooperation with foreign authority meant to preserve the occupied nation's patrimony than its adaptation to imperial designs. Understandably, because as Danish historian Henrik Detlefsen states, quote, "Resistance is the story of human beings who put their lives and well-being at risk against an inhuman tyranny, a story which reinforces our belief that there is ultimately a boundary between good and evil." Detlefsen was writing in 1990 when such moral confidence was waning. Newer historiography suggests that those who resisted, like those who collaborated, were few. The story that should be told might be that of the majority in neither minority. Why the Japanese Empire and why Korea within it? By placing East Asia alongside Europe, the goal is not to deduce a common account of collaboration. There isn't one. Norwegian collaboration was as different from Bulgaria's as from the Philippines. At the same time, I maintain none of these countries' experience warrant description as unique. The 20th century imposes a uniform stamp, if not an easily discernible one. I focus on Korea under Japanese hegemony because, as Japan historian Jeremy Yellen has said, most narratives examine each country's decision to collaborate in isolation, exploring collaboration through a national instead of regional or comparative lens. Scholarship in Western languages on collaborationism touches sparingly on the peninsula, despite the claim that, quote, "the colonial situation in Korea needs to be understood as one of the most significant cultural encounters in the 20th century. Of the occasional works devoted to it, few mention the rest of the world. Studies of World War II seldom concern themselves with East and West at the same time. Tony Jute bemoaned how post-1945 historiography hardly considers Western and Eastern Europe as a whole, yet in his writings, he proceeds as if the whole story of the world after fascism by focusing on Europe to the exclusion of elsewhere. Near the end of his life, Jute could say that with German reunification and the fall of the Soviet Union, the Second World War was finally over. While visitors to the Korean peninsula today soon learn this is not true. I have selected 4 writers who lived under occupation. Lee Kwang-soo, Im Hwa, Kim Sa-ryang, and Jung Hyuk-ju. Their generation included writers who were martyred for their resistance to Japan. And while efforts have been made to rehabilitate collaborationists as conflicted, if not heroic, those efforts never fully succeed. In peninsular memory, these 4 writers are linked with the pro-Japan faction of Koreans who held sway from the last decades of the Chosun dynasty to the end of the Japanese Empire. Chinil today carries a charge of unethical behavior not easily absolved. Other terms can be used, each with their more or less built-in objection, either to deliver summary judgment or to refrain from it: concessions, negotiations, adaptation, or outright betrayal, desertion, and treason, all in current parlance because of disagreement on just what collaboration means. That I choose poets and novelists is not due to any investment in aesthetics, but for the historical record they left behind. Writers unite fact with questions of value and are a corrective to the tendency in philosophy to forsake intimacy with ordinary lives being just what the novelist is most concerned with. There are many languages in which to debate the good and the right, but imaginative literature, where details enrich rather than detract, is one. One might generalize and say literature has been more amenable to leaving morality tenuous, messier, less determinate, more mysterious, in Nussbaum's words, laying open to view the complexity, the indeterminacy, the sheer difficulty of actual human deliberation more than has philosophy. If we ask, where are writers in the chain of responsibility, we must first ask if the exercise of language constitutes an act and is therefore actionable in return, or is it opinion we can dismiss as gratuitous? This question is debated today when such shibboleths as hate speech and thought crimes are taken as literal acts of violence. In the vengeful post-war, speech was identified with action and held culpable for it. Speaking in favor of German victory, writes one French historian, was regarded as a greater crime than physically aiding it. A review of the conundrums Koreans faced under Japanese rule should acknowledge the nuances, subtleties, and consequences we find in their storytelling. In Korea, too, words were considered more of a betrayal than actions. Given the high stakes of language in the construction of a Korean nationalism, leaning heavily on European notions of a Sprachnation, which, unlike Switzerland or Belgium, never needed more justification for why it deserves to be a nation. Lee Kwang-soo, the oldest of my four writers, led the most dramatic life, born just before the First Sino-Japanese War. The child of a once well-to-do family, orphaned at 10, he was rescued by the Tongak Eastern Learning Movement. A precocious student, he was barely a teenager when dispatched to Japan for schooling and went on to become the architect of modern Japanese fiction in his 1917 work, Mujong, or Heartless. At the same time, he is the most famous on the list of colonial Korea's fascist theoreticians. After liberation, he was imprisoned, soon released, but when North Korea overran Seoul at the start of the Korean War, he was arrested again, taken north of the 38th parallel, only to die under still uncertain circumstances. Ye's reputation continues to be overshadowed by the choices he made as colonial Korea's foremost writer. Ye's intellectual trajectory was torn between nationalism, Korean nationalism, and loyalty to Imperial Japan. The binary of pro-Japanese versus anti-Japanese does not serve him well. He argued for Korean independence from a colonial regime, spearheading the Western-style modernization he sought for his country. Later, he argued for Korean assent to an anti-modern, anti-Western program pursued by that same colonial regime, then in a world war. Ye's pro-Japanese actions were less a craven defection and more the consequence of certain ethical beliefs, as self-serving and tortuously reasoned as they might have been, that marked his career from the start. Immanuel, my second writer. was never as cooperative with the colonial regime as Yi was, but he has also attracted ongoing critical attention because his shifting political and literary positions, opportunistic or sincere, captured the vagaries of colonial Korea's literature as a whole. Born 16 years after Yi Guangsu, Im rose to the leadership of the proletarian poetry movement in Korea after a brief flirtation with avant-gardism. Im's 1934 Jongyong, Japanese tenko, or ideological conversion, apostasy, was an early one. This former student of Hegelian dialectics lectured that a writer's heart is independent of politics and ethics and rightly concerned only with craft. But soon enough, he was back to politics, collaborating for Japanese victory. Days after the defeat in 1945, he endeavored to unconvert his conversion with mixed results. In 1947, as one of the Woolbook writers who preferred the communist upper half of the peninsula to the anti-communist lower. For years, one of the DPRK's most prominent writers, in 1953, a Pyongyang military court tried him for collaboration with Japan and espionage for the United States. He was executed by firing squad. Another writer who elected life in the North, Kim Saryang, was born 6 years after Im into an affluent Pyongyang family. He was schooled in Japan, where family connections did not keep him out of trouble, including jail. For no colonial writer was the question of language, Korean or Japanese, more tortured. The stakes were high. How one resolved such choices had consequences. If what one said about Jews was a litmus test for collaboration in Europe, what one said about the Korean language in the Japanese Empire was the equivalent. Kim never came to grips with where he found himself, not only in his choice of languages, but in his choice of sides. He served his Japanese masters when asked to, encouraging Korean men to volunteer for the military, for example. But in the last months of the war, he fled to the Korean independent militia in the Chinese hinterlands and died embedded with DPRK troops retreating from Incheon during the Korean War. Much is written about him, if with little unanimity. In hindsight, talk of resistance and collaboration falls prey to antimony never reconciled. If historians remain of two minds about Kalim as collaborator and Kim as hero, it is because he was both and neither. Some spare Kim the ignominy of being considered a pro-Japanese reactionary, but others do not forgive him, for example, for his essays praising the Nazification of German literature, for which the Reich in Berlin awarded him a prize. Chang Yuk-ju was both an archetypal and extraordinary collaborator, and no colonial period writer remains more scorned by literary historians. He was born out of wedlock to a Daegu landowner and raised by his mother in humble circumstances. Young enough to receive a full Japanese language education in peninsular public schools, Chang was thoroughly Japanized. In his 1975 autobiographical novel, Arashi no Uta, Poem in a Storm, he confesses his attraction, described elsewhere as a nostalgia, for all things Japanese. This was the peculiarity among his fellow pro-Japanese writers, and one that ironically lets him off lightly in the first histories of collaborationist literature. Others declare him the very model of a Korean collaborator who may have begun his career critical of Japanese rule, but with signs portending his later obsequious servitude to it. As a convert to Nihongism, He insisted the people of the peninsula must become Japanese. It is the only way to save those people, he wrote. Today, Zhang is obscure. One literary historian says he was obliterated from literary history for having played the role of a court jester for Imperial Japan. Zhang, irked at being provincialized as a Korean writer, abandoned his native language after 1942, only to grow more fanatically pro-Japanese as the empire found his sycophancy less and less useful. In time, he naturalized as a Japanese citizen. I tried to visit him in the 1990s. I knocked on his door, but no one answered, despite I could hear people inside. Early in their careers, my writers joined in constructive literary collaborations with fellow Japanese. At the same time, they found their works, they found their movements under surveillance, their liberty interrupted by arrest and detention. Collaboration spared them few indignities during the war, and there were no apologies from the defeated Japanese afterwards. Yi Guangsu died in captivity, possibly of forced labor. Imwa was executed in what has been called a poet's tragedy and a politician's comedy. Zhang died in 1997 of natural causes, and no one noticed. They endorsed the Japanese war effort to bring all 8 corners of the world under the rule of an Eastern ethics with the emperor at its core. But none were afforded the luxury, as were many once left-wing Japanese intellectuals who had championed the war, of recanting and starting afresh in 1945. Instead, they were kidnapped, shot, forced into exile, or, in Kim Sa-ryang's case, left for dead on a subsequent battlefield. The Syngman Rhee regime regarded Koreans who collaborated with the Japanese as a political issue, not artistic or historical. It took the Republic of Korea 50 years after the war to make collaboration with the Japanese a matter of public record, when the presidencies of Kim Dae-jung and Roh Moo-hyun made the compilation of lists of alleged collaborators a state project, and which, in Jong-chul Kim's words, reminds, quote, other Koreans that they do not live in a society with no consequences. With few exceptions, post-liberation Korean literature declined to view its burdensome legacy in moral terms. But philosophy bears on these issues because of collaboration, its logic, its appeal or self-justification, its social base, emerges in each country at the intersection of the occupier's intent and the occupied's perception about the range of options at their disposal. It is reasoning which, rank opportunists aside, and maybe not even them, entails recognition of right and wrong, moral, theological, sentimental, and thus is philosophy's business. The unifying ethical concern, putting aside the question, why should I be moral in the first place, is this: how does one choose to be good under occupation when no decision over principles was without unintended consequences? The question preceding these is demonstrable, not hypothetical. 36 years of Japanese occupation immiserated the peninsula. The empire assigned its role of producing grain for the homeland to the near exclusion of feeding its own people. It resulted in rural poverty and starvation, the mass execution of anti-Japanese activists, forced labor that killed thousands, the institutionalized rape of thousands of women, and the use of Koreans in biological and chemical weapon experiments. These injuries are not unique to the Japanese Empire, nor to the 20th century. In our history of the species, we have seldom not lived under alien rule. At the start of the First World War, 85% of the world was ruled by somebody else. The mystery is, how did the cooperation of a citizenry with an occupying people come to be regarded axiomatically as wrong? How do we prove collaboration is morally unjust? Putting anthropological tribalism aside, where it belongs, national self-determination is an idea no older than the French Revolution, which replaced loyalty to the monarch with the principle of people's sovereignty. Claims on our allegiances have proliferated since 1789. It is easier nowadays to be branded or praised as a collaborator when personal relations between people have been replaced with subscriptions to ideas and institutions. To decide if betraying one's sovereign state to serve the interests of another is an a priori wrong, we might consult relevant literature from the Greeks to the present day. How have thinkers responded, or might have responded, to 20th century collaboration from the stance of individual virtue, that would be Aristotle, from considerations of value in consequentialist thinking, which is most philosophers nowadays to one extent or another, and from postmodernism's skepticism over the prospects of any consensus. This inquiry takes me back to asking why colonialism so offends current thinking. That people prefer to be ruled by members of their own ethnic, linguistic, or cultural group, and not one that might provide, admittedly, superior governance. It was not always so. Common sense today says colonialism is objectively harmful, not beneficial, subjectively illegitimate. There are several ways to account for the present view. Here is one: treason and betrayal of a sovereign, a religious faith, a father, a conscience, etc., have long histories, preceding the coalescence of nations by millennia. But collaboration with a political state is of recent vintage, often dated to the advent of nationalism in the 19th and 20th centuries. We view collaboration as the product of the logic of the 19th century nation state, crossed with challenges to that logic, most spectacularly in Europe's wars. It is a modern event, the product of the nation state and its internal tensions playing out over the past 150 years, when actions in everyday life carry political implications for people under siege. Collaboration is also the consequence of a chain of thought that began no later than the 18th century, with the postulate of an autonomy endowed in all people, first at the level of the individual and later the collective nation. We need to return to Immanuel Kant, the first philosopher to attempt a full theory of morality. Loyalty to a nation was already supplanting devotion to religious belief when Kant declared a good will is the only good in itself. But with him, the swap found its theoretician. Autonomy, Kant writes of his postulate of free will, is thus the basis of the dignity of both human nature and rationality. Kant, who bequeathed the individual unconditional self-determination, had his notion extended to unconditional national self-determination. Did Kant foresee Johann Gottlieb Fichte's heir to his bifocal view of man as having both an empirical self subject to natural causation and a transcendental self that enjoyed untrampled moral autonomy, but who took that autonomy and deeded it to nations as well? Love of the fatherland, as Fichte put it in Berlin, occupied by Frenchmen at the time, must govern the state itself. In his study of collaboration and resistance in wartime China, Rana Mitter maintains that, quote, to be a nationalist is not, after all, a question of merit or morality. I disagree. Moral firmament has much to do with the development of nationalism and is discoverable in Fichte's willful reading of Kant. Earlier formulation of the citizen's allegiance to the state were based on a shared consent, presumably by the governed, given presumably by the governed. Fichte's phrase, love of the fatherland, suggests allegiance is instead a matter of nativity. French Orientalist Ernst Renan asserts in his essay, What is a Nation?, that man is neither a slave of his race nor his language, but what else were we becoming by the 19th century? A large aggregate of men, healthy in mind and warm of heart, creates the kind of moral conscience which we call a nation, says Renan. But he credits human beings with too much agency. One of the problems for moral reasoning is when the collective displaces the individual, when it is asserted without controversy that moral principles express the rights and duties that individuals should respect when they act in ways that seriously affect the well-being of other individuals and society, we might conclude that, were one marooned on a desert island, there would be no need for ethical principles at all. But what to do when the last living morsel to eat is also the last of its species? Or what to do with one's own life? What stems from the self-determination of nations is our moral condemnation of collaboration with an occupier. Taking full measure of the ethical conundrum collaborators faced directs us to what is key in Kant's moral theory, Pflicht, duty, the necessity of an action executed from respect for law. Kant could not have foreseen what duty entailed in the 20th century. When he elevated duty, he discarded whatever stewardship Aristotelian virtue might exercise over morality. After the war, many, philosophers included, were confounded by competing principles in judging moral conflict during it. Milan Kundera said 20th century literature is haunted by the spirit of the trial that never took place and those that did, including the trials of collaborators foregone because there were so many to accuse, or too late, or inconvenient to do so. Judgment faced hurdles multiplied by modern wartime special morass of moral calculations. Judgment can be suspect without recognition of the moral axioms underlying the law, which did little to forestall the worst of the 20th century. Judging, Hannah Arendt wrote, is one, if not the most important activity in which this sharing of the world with others comes to pass, a discovery she credited to Kant in his critique of judgment. When it is not enough for the individual to be in agreement with oneself, but that we need to, quote, think in the place of everyone else, from which his notion of an enlarged mentality, Kant's enlarged mentality, derived. The faculty of judgment, Arendt averred with, I am certain, Adolf Eichmann in mind, quote, decides not only how the world is to look, but who belongs together in it. We are not yet beyond the ethical tests of World War II, and more are on their way. Sartre looked upon France's years of occupation in the affirmative, not the negative. As neo-Kantian as he was, he had no patience for the concept of duty. Quite the opposite. The war in Europe barely over. Sartre opened his essay, The Republic of Silence, with the declaration, "We have never been so free as under German occupation." Korea may have lacked for self-declared existentialists at the time of its liberation, but it did share the extreme experience of occupation, forcing Koreans to think about questions that, as Sartre did note, we avoid in peacetime. If I were tortured, would I hold out? Is one such question, and you were free to contemplate your answer, whether you were in Paris's Gestapo headquarters or in Seoul's Sodaemun prison. Here is where I'm going with this. As I look around, people appear to make their ethical choices with a hodgepodge of act consequentialist ideas, i.e. the end justifies the means, with rule consequentialist ones, i.e. we stop at red lights even when there's no traffic, with a lot of deontological guardrails built in. We don't, for example, kill a healthy person to give his organs to let 5 people who need them live. My 4 Korean writers, and what they wrote and how they lived, evidence the same mix of conditional utilitarian ideas, F in proportions that changed after 1945. Thinking that was predominantly rule consequentialist during the late colonial period became act consequentialist when, for one example, Yi Guangsu offered up the same shield defense in his post-liberation apology, My Confession, that Marshal Pétain did at his trial. Quote, I have sacrificed myself for the sake of the nation. This defense didn't work. It didn't work anywhere. Nor did it for the many others who cited it. Both the rules we follow and the acts we perform with the best of intentions have unintended consequences, especially if you're on the defeated side. What should collaborators have done? It is tempting to say our moral views are incoherent. I have 2 responses to that. Maybe they aren't, and if they are, so what? R.M. Hare argues that people start from what he calls the level of intuitive moral thinking, that which we acquire when raised and educated as children. And intuitive moral decisions do us quite well until a conflict arises between them, at which point we resort to Hare's critical level of moral reasoning, which we typically solve by the often irrational process of weighing the respective principles in conflict. And here we are today. I have become less interested in judging what Korean collaborators did in the past, and more with how to determine what each of us ought to do from here on out. What American, whose history has never confronted him or her with the challenge of collaboration with a foreign victor, has had to ponder this with the effort of a mid-20th century Frenchman or Korean, the Dane or the Filipino, or Tibetans, or in Palestine today, where graffiti reads, "The revolution owns 10 bullets, 9 for collaborators and 1 for the enemy." And Americans will again be on the sidelines when we watch what Ukraine decides to do with its Russian collaborators. I'm not asking you to put yourself in my collaborator's shoes. That would ask you to ignore the difference between the cognitive and the affective. After Arendt, I ask you instead to stand beside them and from that adjacent station debate what you would do and act less constrained by the capitalized big facts of history than by your lowercase resolve to think. It may take time. No one wakes up deciding to be a collaborator. The seduction is slow, more temptation than coercion. I am not asking for sympathy on behalf of my writers because sympathy bridles judgment. If we do enlist empathy, we must concede it leads in no guaranteed moral direction. There is always the torturer, if not Sartre, who feels the pain he inflicts on his victims but does not stop torturing. Empathetic German pilots in World War II sounded sirens when bombing civilians, knowing what terror they inspired in their human targets. Some concept of empathy appears in philosophy as early as Mencius, but the English word is of early 20th century provenance, as are its Japanese and Korean neologisms. In the West, Hume had only sympathy in his lexicon when he spoke of it approvingly as an emotional contagion. Empowering empathy runs counter to Kant's rationalism, which assigns empathy no role. I intend to make room for both, arguing we can deploy cognitive empathy, visiting another's emotions rather than participating in them, in crafting moral judgments. And nothing prevents us from combining a visit with logical analysis. The danger is that empathy encourages us to think we are all the same. And logical analysis, if pursued far enough, concludes we are all different. Neither is the whole story. Again, following Hannah Arendt, human differences can be irreducible to each other, but are not incommensurable. Judgment without empathy is burdened, since intersubjectivity, in Arendt's more colloquial phrase, thinking with the world, her improvement upon Kant's enlarged mentality, must be part of it if we are to live with company cognizant of differences as well as similarities. The resulting paradoxical plurality of unique human beings, none of whom leads a life identical to any other in the world we cohabit, is a cornerstone in Arendtian ethics. Empathy neither ensures salubrious moral action on our part, nor forces us to relinquish the right to reject another person's moral decision. Difficult as it may be, Arendt's thinking with the world without surrendering to it is where, I believe, each generation's moral tutorial might begin. Much of what can be said about collaboration in the Japanese Empire can be said about complicity here today. In any future lecture of mine, my examples will not be past tense. They will be selected from the real world crises you read about this morning, and which invite you to wonder how you'd make up your mind to act and under whose command when those crises reach your own doorstep. Ethics is back in literary studies after its dismissal by the academic left as a liberal humanist apology for the bourgeois subject, and by others as an adjunct to discarded metaphysics. Why? Certainly it had returned no later than did the issue of collaboration in the 1980s, when the wartime writings of one of my teachers, Paul de Man, were rediscovered. A real-time event in my life, inspiring my work now, as does the writing of another of my Yale professors, Elie Wiesel, who asked for accountability to withstand the passage of time, however many years. A final word. Since Theodor Adorno during the war, and to Doris Lessing after it, and to the many of us now impressed with what lies ahead for our planet in the global ecological crises, the view has grown that the game is up. Over the past 50 years, the specter of lifeboat ethics has spread on the horizon. Namely, if we simply cannot save everyone, then the question we face is whom? Zygmunt Bauman suggested that the 1997 remake of the film Titanic was a box office smash, not because our ship was headed towards an iceberg, but because we didn't know if we'd make it onto one of the life rafts. Lifeboat ethics, debated in the liminal space between philosophy and the blogosphere, have leaked into government, for example, immigration and foreign aid policies. We may be asked to collaborate or remain complicit with our institutions taking actions few would think moral. Collaborators with the Japanese Empire have been there before. Yi Guangsu, in a compounded misreading of Darwin, wrote, "Morality is the duty of the weak to submit to the strong. Insofar as life is the single objective of all animate creatures, there are no morals in achieving that objective. There is no presumption of evil in a dying man stealing the food of another. It is fitting that rather than die oneself, one should let another die in your place. Against that, we have Socrates' admonition, rare in contemporary moral philosophy, but often repeated by Arendt in the century she shared with Yi Guangsu, that it is better to suffer harm than to do harm. We will see how that goes in the rest of this century. Thank you. Questions, comments?
Okay, I think it falls to me to field the questions. Oh, yeah. Well, people are gathering their thoughts. I might start with a question that was on my mind while I was listening to you. I wish I remembered the aphoristic beauty of the words that you chose, but you defined collaboration as work with or for an external force. But I wonder whether there was something missing in that definition, because we rarely speak of post-war West Germans or post-war Japanese as collaborators if they went along with what their American or Western occupiers.
Yes, isn't that interesting? I mean, there have been no trials of Japanese that collaborated with the American occupation, because Japan is still under occupation, and it's still part of the American world order. So it hasn't had a post-colonial moment.
Would you be comfortable in using the term collaboration without an implicit moral judgment that already refers to the nature of the regime that the collaborator is collaborating with?
Many do. Many do. As I said, I am provisionally using Korean sociologist Jung-Chul Kim's definition. And it works for understanding the way that term is deployed in most scholarship.
Thank you.
Sorry, I had an immediate follow-up to what Fabian said. I was thinking about one of your writers. When he died, he was accused of collaborating with the Japanese and being a spy for the Americans. And I just wondered if you could explain that, because they don't seem like a normal pairing of.
He was put on trial in the 1950s. So he was put on trial in North Korea 7 or 8 years after the Japanese occupation ended, but the American occupation really hadn't ended of Korea, of the American occupation. So, I mean, these are all trumped up charges anyway. I mean, it was a Stalinist show trial. His patron on the Central Committee had lost favor, blah, 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 blah. There's all of this. Through the 1960s, left-wing opinion in Japan held that Imwa had engaged in U.S. espionage. But no one believes that now. We won't know until the North Korean archives are opened, and who knows when that will be.
Chloe Starr.
Thank you, that was really interesting. So I suppose I have a literary question. If you're creating a genre of collaborationist literature, then I have two questions. One is a sort of comparative collaborationist literatures. Do you have any sense of, in terms of that as a genre, what draws it together? The other one is, how does somebody, once a collaborator, always a collaborator? Can you ever get out of that? What happens when people renege on their commitments and change? Are they forever tarred by it? It seems yes from your speech in general.
Yeah, interesting question. Thank you, Chloe. So it was a taboo subject in Korea until the late 60s, when a gentleman by the name of Im Chong-guk wrote a study of what he called Chinil Munhak. Chinil Munhak non was his book, and it was the first time that there was an accounting of what he considered collaborationist writings. Now, he kind of exempted Chung Il-ju. I mean, Chung Il-ju was in that book, but he says, well, this is really different. This guy was into Japan when he was 2 years old. Okay, his collaboration wasn't the result of an adult decision to betray his country. So he's put to the side. He does consider Kim Sa-ryang a collaborationist writer. There are now literary prizes in South Korea in Kim Sa-ryang's name. So yes, people move in and out of this category. Slowly, temporarily, but yes. Yeah, there's no stable canon of pro-Japanese Korean writers.
Thank you for your wonderful presentation, lecture. I'm working on pre-modern Japan, and I am trying to write something on Abe no Nakamaro, who spent some time in China. And I'm looking at a manuscript that has sort of essays on Nakamaro. One person is saying, well, he was a traitor because he served the court of China, Tang Dynasty China. And others in Edo period Japan are saying that, well, times were different, and he went to China because he admired, sort of the culture and the scholarship there, and not necessarily trying to demean Japan in any way. And I was wondering if the figure of the traitor is somehow, how is it different from the figure of the collaborator, and how do they overlap in your understanding?
I'm not a scholar of China, particularly not its collaborationist literature, but the Chinese term hanjian, or traitor, is used millennia ago and today. That term doesn't change in Chinese discourse. In Korean, you can be called a meguja, a person who sold the country, okay? A baikokunin in Japanese. But there is nothing like being called shinnichi, chinil. I have been called shinnichi because the term can often not mean pro-Japanese, but it can mean knowledgeable about Japan. So there's slipperage there as well. These terms fall in and out of fashion. It's only since the 1970s that people have spoken of a number of Korean intellectuals as what they call pro-Japanese nationalists. That they were pro-Japanese because they were interested in furthering the welfare of the Korean people. I won't use that term, because if you were an adherent to Nihon Shugi, to Nihonism, you took the emperor as the center of your ethical world. And that trumped any notion of a national subject. And so I think this recent use of the term pro-Japanese nationalist is simply a way to work around the dilemma that I've tried to point out in what we really mean by these terms. It's interesting, everyone says, oh, well, ethical decisions are relative. We live in a relativistic world. I mean, I think John Dean during the Watergate hearings used that, I believe relativism is what the word we come up with when two ethical sets of laws are in conflict with each other. There's no relativism. There's indecision. But that's just my opinion. Uh-oh, now I'm in trouble. A philosopher.
I'm not sure I'd use that denomination. Thank you very much for your fascinating lecture. I wanted to ask a bit more about, I can't remember the Korean word, but the concept of tenko in Japanese, so ideological apostasy. There seems to be a kind of moral valence to the expression apostasy in English, and I think tenko in Japanese as well, which encodes a certain kind of critique that we think if people give up their beliefs, or they change their beliefs, they must be insincere.
Yes.
That they never really believe them.
Yeah.
I would invite you maybe to reflect more on that as a concept, but I wonder to what extent, in the first instance, apostasy is a requisite conceptual component of collaboration, that part of the critique of the collaborationists is that they were insincere in their original advocacy, but also to what extent that impinges on your observation just now about moral relativism, that it seems to me built into the concept of apostasy is a presumption against moral relativism.
Great question, great question. I'm not happy with the word apostasy, but it's used in a lot of scholarship, which is one reason why I translate it this way. You know where it comes from? It doesn't come from church doctrine. It comes from William James in his work on conversion, on religious conversion. He uses the word apostasy, and he doesn't use it in the sense of moral approbation or, but the reason I do use it is because this commitment to emperor worship, to Japanese imperialism, takes on, if you read, when you committed Tenko or Chongyong, with one exception, you had to publish it. So we can read what people wrote. It takes on the style, if not the vocabulary, of St. Augustine, becoming a Christian. I'm not a scholar of Nihon Shugi. There are such. I'd be interested to know to what extent we could call it a religious faith as opposed to simply an ideology.
We have time for one more question. Well, there are two. Well, if we can make them brief.
I don't think you've had a question from a woman yet.
Yes. Well.
Oh, Valerie, right. Sorry. I'm in the doghouse.
I think you're gender blind, Thanks. I want to know more about a literature. Pardon my ignorance that I haven't really read these authors. I think I've read a story you translated from one of them about love.
Yes.
But that is all I know. And I wanted to know how their collaboration is reflected in their literature. Are they just mere Japanophiles, or are they supporting the Imperial Project?
All of the above. When they were castigated, arrested, imprisoned, the actions that they were held culpable for were two. One, Korean writers were enlisted on lecture tours in the Japanese islands, in Korea, in Manchuria, encouraging Korean men to enlist in the Imperial Army. And that was seen as treasonous behavior. The other thing was arguing for the elimination of the Korean language, which many of them did. Chang Hyuk-ju said it took Great Britain 100 years to basically eliminate Welsh from Wales. We'll do the same to Korea in much shorter time. So those were the two things that really they were held culpable for. But when you read their literature, what I'm interested in is they write stories about Koreans in Korea or in Japan faced with a dilemma. They're not, this isn't vitriolic writing. These are very interesting stories about Koreans facing real conundrums. And by analyzing those stories, I'm able to abstract what I think moral philosophy would call utilitarianism or virtue philosophy, or so on and so forth. So just like pro-imperial literature in Japan, it's not all rah-rah, the work is very good. The work is very nuanced. I mean, people say collaborationist writers in China weren't very good. I don't know if that's true or not. I'm suspicious of that. But I can tell you collaborationist writers in Korea were often exceptionally good. And they did it by writing moving, real stories about Koreans facing decisions that either they resigned themselves to or refused to act in such a way that accommodates Japanese imperial aims. And those are the stories that are in, you can go get a chunship, you can get a zenshu of pro-Japanese Korean literature. They have them now. I'm sure you have them in your library here. And sometimes you read them and you say to yourself, well, what's wrong with this story? What's wrong with the story is written by the wrong person. Okay? We've decided Yi Guangsu is one of the bad guys. So it's very hard to get something even heartless, even Mujong, exempted from the political judgment his reputation suffers from.
Since some people will have to leave right at 6, I'm afraid we won't have time for another question, but happily there is a reception waiting for us upstairs, and I hope the conversation can continue. But before we go upstairs, please join me in thanking John Treat for challenging us to think about these important questions.